This audio production was made in collaboration with Audible Anarchist.
Chapter 24: The National State and the Development of Science. Just as the structure of economic and political social forms is not bound up with particular peoples, races, or nations, so also the thought and feeling of the individual does not follow definite national lines, but is always influenced by the ideas of the time and the cultural circle to which he belongs. Great pioneer ideas in the fields of science and of philosophic thought, new forms of artistic expression, never arise from a whole people or an entire nation, but always merely from the creative power of enlightened minds in whom genius is revealed. How a genius arises no one has yet determined. A genius may come out of any people, but what special merit the people or the nation has in this no one can say. However, there is no people, no nation, no race of geniuses. There never has been one. It is because of this that the endeavor of our modern race fatalists are so hopelessly muddled and senseless. But even genius does not owe everything to its own powers. Even the greatest mind does not stand outside of time and space. He is, like all others, bound to the past and the present. This is what is significant in genius, that it lends voice and form to what lies slumbering in many, and forms a unified concept of the separate results of the intellectual development of a period. The mind of the genius is a universal mind, which builds out of all that has gone before it a new world picture, and thus opens to mankind new outlooks on life. The deeper it is rooted in its social environment, the more precious are the fruits which it brings to maturity. No one has felt this more deeply than Goethe, who said, "At bottom, however, we are all collective beings, pose however we please, for how little we have and how little we are that we can, in the strictest sense, call our own. We must all receive and learn as well from those who were before us, as from those who were with us. Even the greatest genius would not get far if he wished to owe everything to what he had within him. But very many worthy men do not understand this, and, with their dreams of originality, grope half their lives in the dark. I have known artists who boasted of having followed no master, rather of owing everything to their own genius. The fools! As if that happened anywhere, and as if the world were not pressing on them at every step, and, in spite of their stupidity, making something out of them. Perhaps I may speak of myself and tell modestly how I feel. It is true that during my long life I have undertaken and accomplished a great variety of things of which perhaps I might boast. But what did I have, if we want to be honest, that was really my own, except the ability and the inclination to see and to hear, to decide and to choose, and to animate what I had seen and heard with my own spirit and reproduce it with some skill? I owe my works in no way to my own wisdom alone, but thousands of things and persons outside me offered me the material for them. There came fools and wise men, clear heads and muddled ones, childhood and youth, as also ripe old age. All told me how they felt, what they thought, how they lived and worked, and what experiences they had gathered, and I had nothing more to do than to seize and reap what they had sown for me. At bottom, it is just all nonsense whether one gets something out of himself, or whether he gets it from others, whether one works through himself or works through others. The chief thing is that one have a great will and possess skill and persistence to carry it out. All the rest does not matter." End quote. We are always dependent upon our predecessors, and for this reason the notion of a, quote, national culture, end quote, is misleading and inconsistent. We are never in a position to draw a line between what we have acquired by our own powers and what we have received from others. Every idea, whether it be of a religious, an ethical, a philosophic, a scientific, or an artistic nature, had its forerunners and pioneers, without which it would be inconceivable, and it is usually quite impossible to go back to its first beginnings. Almost invariably, thinkers of all countries and peoples have contributed to its development. Let us take as examples two theories that penetrate deeply and shake to their very foundations all previous conceptions, as do the Copernican system and the Darwinian theory of evolution. These two doctrines not only transformed fundamentally the views of men about the structure of the universe and the development of life upon Earth. In doing this, they worked with genuine revolutionary effect upon every other field of human thought and brought about a complete overturning of all previously known science. But here, too, the new knowledge broke its path only gradually, until in the course of time enough factual material was accumulated so that a brilliantly gifted mind could draw from it the necessary conclusion and give to the new views a clear foundation. To what beginnings the idea that the Earth turns on its own axis and, together with the other planets, moves around the Sun goes back historically will perhaps never be ascertained. Albert Einstein, the honored founder of the theory of relativity, remarks with justice that, especially where the fundamental principles of physics are concerned, man is always stumbling on something earlier, so that it is almost impossible to follow any line of discoveries back to its first beginning. Even if we were unanimous in honoring Aristarchus of Samos as the first great forerunner of the Copernican system, we should still always entertain the suspicion that he may in turn have drawn upon Egyptian sources. No objection can be urged against the concept on this account, because this is shown anew in the history of every new invention and discovery. Not even from the most brilliant brain does a new idea spring full-grown, like Minerva from the head of Jupiter. It is therefore indisputable that the idea of a heliocentric universe was grasped in a premonitory fashion by bold thinkers long before Copernicus, and, by a few, was given a more or less convincing foundation. The Italian scholar Schiaparelli has set this forth clearly in a special monograph, Precursor del Copernico. That the Greeks were deeply indebted to the Babylonians and the Egyptians for their knowledge of astronomy and physics is today quite beyond question. So it does not matter whether or not the Ionian natural philosopher Thales of Miletus was in fact a pupil of the Babylonian thinker Berossus. Certainly there existed between Greece and the countries of the Orient very close connections, which must have had their intellectual effects. Thus it was said of Pythagoras that he travelled in Egypt and the East and acquired there a great part of his knowledge of astronomy and mathematics. In fact, the school of the Pythagoreans was distinguished for its bold conception of the structure of the universe. Plutarch relates of the Pythagorean Philios that according to his teaching the earth and the moon move in an oblique circle about the central fire. It is known with certainty that Aristarchus of Samos developed the theory of a heliocentric universe. It is true that his essay on the subject has been lost, but we find in Plutarch and in the calculation of the sands of Archimedes short sketches of the theory of Aristarchus, from which we learn that he maintained that the earth turns on its own axis and also moves about the sun as center, while the stars and the sun remain motionless in space. We do not know how widespread such teachings were, but it is easily conceivable that the adherents of the geocentric system, which places the earth at the center of the universe, were in the majority, since direct observation seemed to speak for them. Even the famous system of the Alexandrian Ptolemy, as he had developed it in his Almagest, which held captive the minds of men for a millennium and a half, had its forerunners and was merely the completion of the great work which Hipparchus of Nicaea had begun 300 years before. Hipparchus, moreover, owed much of his doctrine to the Chaldean astrologers. That the Ptolemaic system could endure so long without contradiction was owing chiefly to the influence of the Church. Religion had set up the earth as the center of creation, had elevated man to the position of crown of creation, the image of God himself. It, therefore, did not suit the Church that the earth should lose its point of vantage as the center of all things, and circle about the sun like all the other planets. Such an idea was incomprehensible to the religious temperament, and might give rise to serious consequences. This was the reason why the Church fought the doctrine of Copernicus so long and so bitterly. In Rome, until the resolution of the Cardinals of the Inquisition, which Pius VII sanctioned in September 1823, no book could be printed or publicly circulated in which the theory of a heliocentric universe was advocated. How many secret opponents of the Ptolemaic system there were during this long period of its unlimited dominion can, of course, not be determined. Only under the influence of the rediscovered writings of the ancients, which were first transmitted to the European peoples in any large measure by the Arabs, did there develop, especially in the Italian cities, a new spirit which set itself against the authority of Aristotle and Ptolemy. Bold thinkers like Demencio Maria Novara, 1454 to 1504, revealed to their pupils the Pythagorean doctrines and involved the idea of a new picture of the universe. Copernicus, who in those years was pursuing his studies at Bologna and Padua, fell completely under the sway of this new intellectual movement, which doubtless gave him the first impulse toward the development of his theory. Actually, he was in the years 1506 to 1512 laying the foundations of his theory, which he enlarged later in his principal work concerning the revolution of the heavenly bodies, which appeared in 1543. His work had been preceded by an essay, long since lost, entitled A Short Sketch of the Probable Movements of the Heavens, which was rediscovered by the Copernican scholar Kurtzer and published in the 70s. Even if Copernicus did not hit upon the idea of the heliocentric system quite of himself, still his is the indisputable merit of having developed and established the new conception on scientific principles. In his famous Seven Theses, Copernicus defended the notion that there is only one center for the stars and their orbits, that the center of the Earth is not the center of the universe, but merely the center of the moon's orbit and its own mass, that all the planets revolve about the sun, which stands at the center of their orbits, that the distance from the Earth to the sun is, in relation to the width of the firmament, smaller than the semi-diameter of the Earth in relation to the distance from Earth to sun, and hence vanishes when compared with the size of the firmament, that what seems to us a movement of the heavens is not such, but is due to a motion of the earth, in which the earth and its immediate environment rotates daily, while its two poles retain constantly the same direction, that the heavens, on the other hand, remain immovable quite to their uttermost limit, that what seems to us a movement of the sun is not due to that star, but to the earth and its orbit, in which we move about the sun like the other planets, the earth having therefore a twofold movement, that the advance and retrogression of the planets is not a consequence of their movement, but of that of the earth, that the multiplicity of heavenly phenomena finds, therefore, its complete explanation in the movement of the earth. To this new theory of Copernicus, history offers few comparable intellectual achievements, yet with it the proud structure of the heliocentric system of the universe was not quite finished. From the beginning it found a flock of enthusiastic supporters, but still more opponents, so that it was able at first to make its way only gradually. At the outset, the new theory met with the best reception in Germany, where the power of the Church had been badly shaken by the Reformation. From this we must not conclude that Protestantism was any more favourably inclined to it. That was not at all the case. Luther and Melanchthon were just as uncomprehending and hostile toward the new doctrine as the Pope, but the new Church had not yet had time enough to cement its power, and for this reason could not be so dangerous to the daring novelty as the Catholic Church in Latin countries. In Italy, Giordano Bruno, to whom the Copernican system had rendered good service as the basis for his nature philosophy, had to atone for his boldness at the stake in 1600, while Galileo, the most brilliant teacher of the new view of the universe, perhaps escaped the same fate only by letting himself be moved to renounce his alleged errors before the tribunal of the Inquisition. The theory of Copernicus received a powerful impulse from the German astronomer Johannes Kepler, the most distinguished pupil of Tycho Brahe, to whom he doubtless owed very much. Kepler developed in his new astronomy, and in a later work his famous three laws, by which he brought out with astounding cleverness, and after long and vain experiment, a mathematical proof of the correctness of the Copernican system. This brilliant thinker, whose intellectual greatness could not protect him from the bitterest misery, showed to his contemporaries that the paths of the planets are not actually circles but ellipses, which, however, differ very little from true circles. Most important of all, he showed how the distances of the planets from the sun could be calculated from their periods of revolution, and what relation the velocity of their movement at different points in their orbits bears to their distance from the sun. Kepler had already grasped as a presumption that great unity of the cosmic laws which Newton later developed so brilliantly. Almost at the same time, but independently of Kepler, Galileo Galilei of Pisa achieved a deeper insight into the operation of mechanical forces and established the laws of falling bodies, the motion of the pendulum, and projectiles, which put him in a position to answer all physical objections to this heliocentric system. But even in this field there had been a forerunner. Thus the Genevan Michel Varro had already in 1585 clearly recognized the interrelation of the mechanical laws, and Simon Stevin of Bruges, 1548-1620, had tried, independently of him, to establish practically the principle of those laws. Besides these two, there were still other isolated thinkers who were active with more or less success in the same field. After they began to puzzle out the diaries of Leonardo da Vinci, it became clearer and clearer that this genuinely universal intellect had anticipated Galileo and many another in several respects, as for example, the explanation of the law of falling bodies, the wave theory, and a few more. With the help of the telescope which he constructed, Galileo succeeded in making a considerable number of important discoveries in celestial space. Thus, by the discovery of the moons of Jupiter, he offered convincing proof that there actually were heavenly bodies which did not revolve about the Earth. All in all, the invention of the telescope led to a whole series of similar discoveries which were made in different countries and quite independently of one another. We need only recall here the observations of the Jesuit Father Christopher Scheiner in Ingolstadt, of Johannes Fabricius in Ostil, Friesland, and of Thomas Harriot in Isleworth, England. After Kepler had succeeded in establishing the movements in space mathematically by his three fundamental laws, and Galileo had formulated the general principles of the force of gravity as these are revealed on the Earth, the idea lay ready to hand that the same laws operate not only upon our planet but in the entire universe, and that they determine the movements of the heavenly bodies. Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1621, who has been called the father of the inductive method, already dreamed of a time when the human mind would succeed in tracing all events in space to the same uniform physical laws. It was Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727, the brilliant English mathematician and natural philosopher who helped the doctrines of Copernicus and Kepler to a final effective victory by his formulation of the so-called law of gravitation. Newton established that the force which makes an apple that has been loosened fall to the ground is the same which holds the planets in their orbits in space. He recognized that the force of attraction which resides in every body increases with its mass at such a rate that a body twice as heavy attracts another twice as strongly. Along with this, he discovered too that the attractive force of a body increases or diminishes with its smaller or greater distance from another body, and that it is inversely proportional to the square of the distance, that therefore a body of the size of the Earth, but twice as far away from the Sun, is pulled by the Sun only 1/4 as forcibly. Newton reduced this relation to a definite formula, with the aid of the infinitesimal calculus, a mathematical method which makes possible calculation with infinitely small magnitudes, and which the English thinker conceived almost simultaneously with the German philosopher Leibniz. He was able to prove the correctness of his discovery. This is set forth in his celebrated work Principia Mathematica. In this he also furnished the best confirmation of the heliocentric system of Copernicus and of the three laws of Kepler. Since then, the law which bears Newton's name has been the basis of all astronomical calculations. But just as Newton's brilliant discovery had its own anticipators, like Edmund Halley, Robert Hooke, Christopher Wren, and others, who had all busied themselves with the problem of gravitation, so the theory was in no way a finality. In its turn, like every other great discovery, it gave to the impulse to further researches and observations. On the results of Newtonian theory rested the splendid contributions of the famous mathematician Leonhard Euler of Basel, and of the two Frenchmen Alexis Clairvaux and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert. Here, too, we may mention the Danish astronomer Olaf Romer, who was early as 1675, before the appearance of Holland during the first decade of the 17th century, and the two spectacle makers, Hans Lippershey and Zacharias Janssen, were actually named as the inventors. Individual instruments, however, had been constructed before this. The invention was, so to speak, in the air, and its further development was aided by minds of every nation. Before the appearance of Newton's principal work, on the basis of the Copernican system, had undertaken measurement of the velocity of light from the occurrence of eclipses of the moons of Jupiter. Newton's intellectual achievement gave the impulse to numerous new discoveries which smoothed the way for that great theory which the French astronomer Pierre Laplace, 1749 to 1827, set forth in his two works, Exposition du système du monde and Traité de la mécanique céleste, in which he gave an explanation of the origin of our planetary system and traced all events in space to the operation of purely physical forces. But even his theory did not put the capstone on the structure of the new conception of the universe. It was essentially corrected, broadened, and extended by men like Friedrich Gauss, J. Lagrange, P. A. Hansen, A. L. Cauchy, J. C. Adams, S. Newcomb, H. Dildon, F. Tisserand, and numerous thinkers of all peoples and nations. Astrophysics also, which acquired such a splendid impetus during the course of the last century, developed in the same manner. Before the genius of Gustav Kirchhoff had succeeded in establishing the chemical composition of the sun by his discovery of spectrum analysis, a whole troop of thinkers and investigators had preceded him in the various countries, men like W. H. Wollaston, Joseph Fraunhofer, W. A. Miller, L. Foucault, A. J. Angstrom, Balfour Stewart, G. Stokes, and many others, on whose results Kirchhoff depended, while he brilliantly extended them and wrote them into a synthetic whole. On the other hand, the discovery of spectrum analysis opened the way for innumerable new inventions and discoveries which, because of their abundance, cannot even be mentioned here. It is therefore indisputable that in the creation and development of our modern picture of the universe, brilliant minds of all countries have contributed, of whom only a few of the best-known names could be mentioned briefly. Further, the relativity theory of Albert Einstein, with the help of which he has succeeded in solving the mystery of the orbit of Mercury in a manner as surprising as it is brilliant, would have been impossible without these countless predecessors. Let the incorrigible race fanatics enjoy themselves improving from traditional portraits of Copernicus, Galileo, or Laplace, the membership of these men in the Nordic race. No one will envy them their childish sport. Wherever intellect speaks, nationality and race vanish like mist before the wind, and it would be a senseless undertaking to try to judge a social idea, a religion, or a scientific theory by its national content or according to the racial characteristics of its leaders. We have seen how Poles, Germans, Italians, Frenchmen, Englishmen, Danes, Swedes, Dutchmen, Belgians, Swiss, and others have worked for the victory of the heliocentric system. That intellectual structure was born of their united labor. To its development a whole world contributed, and its character cannot be determined by any political confession of faith nor by special national characteristics. When we are dealing with intellectual phenomena, the universal in human thought becomes most clearly apparent and can be dammed in by no national limits, or as Goethe so strikingly put it, quote, "There is no patriotic art and no patriotic science. Both belong like every exalted good to the whole world and can be fostered only by the general free cooperation of all who live at the same time with constant regard for what remains known to us from the past." End quote. What has been said here in a few words about the development of the Copernican theory holds good in still greater degree for the modern theory of evolution, which in such an astonishingly short time led to a complete reconstruction of all traditional concepts and hypotheses. Leaving out of consideration the heliocentric system, there is hardly any doctrine which has had such a deep and lasting effect upon the whole of human thought as the idea of gradual development of all natural forms and manifestations of life under the influence of the environment and the external conditions of life. The new theory led not merely to a complete revolution in all fields of the natural science, it developed also quite new points of view in sociology, history, and philosophy. Even the religious leaders who at first fought the idea of evolution most bitterly found themselves compelled to make far-reaching concessions to it and, after their fashion, to accommodate themselves to it. In a word, the idea of evolution has taken such complete possession of us and influences our whole thought to such a degree that we can today hardly conceive of any other view. However, even this idea, which seems to us today so self-evident, did not burst suddenly upon the world, but like all great intellectual achievements, only gradually matured and won general acceptance. How far back the first glimmerings of the theory of evolution extend historically will perhaps never be established. It is certain that the idea of a natural development of all things was already fairly widespread among the earliest of the Greek thinkers, and very probably would have guided the whole intellectual life of the European peoples into quite different channels, if under the domination of the Church the writings of the ancient sages had not remained so long unknown. As it was, they were transmitted only in fragments and in greatly diluted form to the men of a later epoch, who were controlled by quite different ideas. Already among the Ionian philosophers, and especially in the Anaximenes, we find the idea of a primal substance in which there resides a generative and transforming force revealing itself in production and alteration of the living beings on the earth. Empedocles appears to have had a very profound grasp of this conception when he expressed the opinion that the different living forms owe their origin to special combinations of the primal substance. This bold and unique thinker was already explaining the evolution of organic beings through adaptation to their environment, since, according to his view, Forms suitably equipped would be able to maintain themselves, while the others would disappear. In Heraclitus and the Greek autonomists, as well as among the Epicureans and others, references are found to a gradual evolution and transformation of all manifestations of life. These Lucretius later assembled in his famous didactic poem, and they have thus come down to us. Moreover, it is clear from the work of Lucretius that the ancient thinkers were by no means dealing with a vague notion to which later generations have attributed a meaning corresponding to their own way of thinking, but with a clear conception. And while this was very often based on insufficient grounds, its kernel is unmistakable. It was only by the prevalence of Christian dogmatism, which had committed itself completely to the biblical legend of the creation and would permit no other view, that these brilliant beginnings of a theory of evolution were for 15 centuries pushed into the background, though the idea itself never completely disappeared. It reappeared in the Middle Ages with the Arabian philosophers, Farabi and Avicenna, although in a very peculiar form, strongly influenced by Neoplatonism. It likewise found expression in the noteworthy work Makor Chaim of the Jewish Kabbalists. Avicebro, also translated into Latin, reminiscent in some respects of the German mystic Jakob Bohm, in which the Kabbalist recognizably came close to a premonition of the idea of an eternal development of all things. The Scottish scholastic Duns Scotus also came very close to the idea of a development of the universe on the basis of definite physical laws. Under the influence of the great discoveries of Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and other enlightened minds of that period, the idea of evolution made a new beginning. Bernardo Telesio, the great Italian scholar and philosopher, and one of the first to contradict the ideas of Aristotle, which had dominated the Middle Ages, had undertaken in his work De Rerum Naturia to trace all natural events to the operation of natural laws, seeking to explain every manifestation of the universe by the motion of its elements, thus coming at least close to the concept of universal evolution in nature. Before all, however, mention must be made here of Giordano Bruno, in whose pantheistic line of thought the idea of evolution is clearly reflected. Bruno, who in the shaping of his doctrine reached back to the ideas of Democritus and the ancient atomists, combined their views with the Copernican conception of the universe, and following in the footsteps of Epicureans, arrived at the conviction that the universe is unlimited, an idea which was obviously unknown to Copernicus, since he represented the universe as bounded by the sphere of the fixed stars. The multiplicity of forms in which matter appears arises, according to the view of the great Italian nature philosopher, of itself without any external impulse. Matter, so Bruno argues, is not formless, rather it conceals within itself the germs of all forms, and since it unfolds what it carries hidden within it, it is, in truth, the mother of nature and of all living beings. The French physicist and empiricist Gassendi, also appropriating the doctrines of Epicurus, traced the origin of the world to the play of the atoms, which he thought of as endowed with the power of self-movement. He saw in the atoms the primal particles of all things, out of which everything arises and moves toward completion. It is interesting to observe how strongly the ideas of the ancient Grecian nature philosophers, which had suddenly awakened to new life, influenced the thought of the best minds from a considerable time before the discovery of Copernicus up to the time of the French encyclopedists. Thus, the work of Lucretius was at the time of Voltaire in the hands of all educated people. Demonstrably, it was chiefly the teaching of the ancient atomists which suggested to thinkers like Descartes, Gassendi, and others the idea that a gradual development underlies all events in nature. Nor can we here pass over the brilliant Jewish thinker Baruch Spinoza, who explained all phenomenon of the process of the universe as owing to implicit necessity, and not only had a conception of the general idea of evolution, but anticipated some of its most fundamental hypotheses, such as, for example, the impulse of self-preservation. On the eve of the Great Revolution, France was the center of a new development in human thinking, which has been rightly designated as the intellectual introduction to the latest social upheaval. The ancient views of the universe and man, of state and society, of religion and morals underwent a fundamental transformation. The publication of the famous encyclopedia was a pretentious attempt to subject the whole body of human knowledge to a rigorous examination and to set it up again on new foundations. Such a time could but be extremely propitious for the advancement of the doctrine of evolution. In fact, we find among a whole line of the thinkers of that period of ferment more or less definite beginnings toward the theory of evolution, by which the later researchers were inspired. Maupertuis attempted to account for the origin of organic life from atoms endowed with sensitivity. Diderot, the most universal intellect of this period, undertook to depict the origin and shaping of religions, moral conceptions, and social institutions as a graduated development, having as predecessors in this field thinkers like Bodin, Bacon, Pascal, and Vico. Condorcet, Lessing, and Herder struck out along similar lines and saw in the whole of human history a constant process of transformation from lower to more complicated and higher forms of culture. Lemaitre recognized that we know nothing essential about the nature of motion and matter, but that man is, nevertheless, in a position to establish by observations the sole difference between inorganic and organic matter. That is, that the latter is self-regulating, but for this very reason uses up its vital forces, and dissolves after the death of the living being in its inorganic constituents. And just as the organic develops out of the inorganic, so out of the organic develops the mental. According to Lemaitre's theory, all higher forms of existence are subject to exactly the same laws as the whole of organic and inorganic nature. Therefore, he set up no artificial boundary between man and beast, and saw in both only different results of the same natural processes. Robinet came to similar conclusions and held to the standpoint that all functions of the mind were dependent upon those of the body. Holbach, in his Système de la Nature, brought together these different views and, taking off from strictly materialistic lines of thought, developed the idea of a gradual genesis of the different living forms on the basis of the same uniform natural laws. In Germany, Leibniz, who tried to counteract the materialism of the French thinkers, repeatedly exposed himself to the attack of Lemaitre and his sympathizers. Yet his theory of monads, which has unmistakable points of contact with the views of modern biology, led him also to the idea of a gradual formation of the universe, as has been so often pointed out by modern exponents of the theory of evolution. Kant had an even clearer understanding of the idea of evolution than Leibniz when, in his Allgemeine Naturgeschichte und Theorie des Himmels, he maintained that the whole system of the universe had evolved from revolving nebulae, the chaotic notions of primal matter gradually assuming fixed and permanent orbits. Kant saw in the universe the result of the operation of physical and mechanical forces, and held the conviction that the cosmos had gradually shaped itself out of chaos and in the course of an enormous period of time would sink into it again and begin the process anew. He saw the world as a continuous play of becoming and dissolving. Hegel, too, saw in the course of nature an uninterrupted process of development, and in the metaphysical fashion that was peculiar to him, he transferred these ideas to human history. It was to this circumstance that he chiefly owed his great influence over his contemporaries. The theory of evolution was already unmistakably in the air. It would lead us too far to develop more fully here to what a degree thinkers like Malpighi, Malebranche, Monet, and others, each in his own way, helped on the idea. The word evolution was already in frequent use among men of science in the first half of the 18th century, a proof that the idea of evolution dwelt more and more in men's thoughts. Among the forerunners of the modern theory of evolution as it found expression with Darwin and his numerous successors, the French natural philosopher Buffon deserves special regard because his views are to be thought of less as the outcome of philosophical speculation than of practical experiments and earnest, laborious research. Buffon was one of the most intellectual men of his time, and the full significance of many of his inspirations was not properly recognized until long afterward. His natural history was not merely a greatly conceived attempt at a rational explanation of the course of the events in the universe. It developed in many other fields also a great many fruitful ideas. Thus he demonstrated from practical examples that alteration of plant and animal species can arise from many causes, his idea being quite the same as Darwin's was later. Buffon recognized also that the process of evolution can never reach a definite end, and deduced from this that science would be able, by tests and observations, to establish beyond question certain manifestations of it. It is therefore easy to understand how a man of such splendid gifts could have such a great influence on thinkers like Goethe, Lamarck, and Saint-Hilaire. At the beginning of the 19th century, the idea of evolution had everywhere found its way into all unprejudiced minds. Its most distinguished advocate at that time was Goethe, in whose brilliant personality the prophetic vision of the poet was in the happiest way combined with the keen and sober gift of observation of the investigator. Goethe was powerfully stimulated by Buffon in his studies in the natural history and developed as early as 1790 in his Über die Metamorphose der Pianger ideas which lie wholly within the line of thought of the theory of descent, as when he traced the origin of all the organs of a plant to metamorphosis, that is, to the modifications of a single organ. The leaf, an idea which occurred later to Lamarck, Goethe applied the same ideas to the animal world also, and gave us in his vertebrate theory a splendid example of penetrating keenness of observation. Moreover, his concept of the geological changes in the Earth's surface crust contains several ideas that were only later worked out and established more fundamentally by Lyell and Hoff. A unique forerunner of the evolution theory was Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who, doubtless influenced by Lucretius in his comprehensive didactic poem Zoonomia, tried to account for the origin of the universe and of all life on the earth on an evolutionary historical basis, and expressed many ideas that come surprisingly close to our modern view. The German nature philosopher Treverianus, in his work Biology, quote, Oder die Philosophie der Lebenden, naturally, which appeared in the years 1802 to 1805, advocated the idea that all higher living beings have developed from a small number of primitive original forms, and that every form of life is the result of physical influences which differ only in the direction and the degree of effectiveness of their operation. Lorenz Oken, a contemporary of Goethe, quite independently of him, developed the view that the cranium is made up of vertebrae and is only a continuation of the spinal column, and concluded that every living being is composed of cells and that all organic life on the earth had originated in a primal plasma. Oken also made an attempt to reclassify the whole plant and animal world according to descent. This long line of bold thinkers of every nation, who with justice are called the pioneers of the modern theory of evolution, came to an end with the French zoologist Lamarck, still a pioneer, but most effective. In his Philosophie zoologique, which appeared in 1809, he assembled the more or less developed ideas of his predecessors, together with his own theories, and gave them a definite scientific basis. He assailed the doctrine of the unalterability of species and concluded that these seem to us unalterable merely because the process of transformation is too gradual to be comprehended within the brief span of a human life. These transformations are nevertheless indisputable and are conditioned by alterations in climate, means of subsistence, and other phenomena of the environment. He concludes, quote, It is not the organs, that is, the nature and structure of the body parts of an animal, which have produced its habits and special capabilities, but on the contrary its habits, its manner of life, and the conditions under which the individuals from which it descends were forced to live, have in time determined its bodily structure, the number and condition of its organs and capabilities. End quote. The great reaction which was noticeable everywhere in Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, and which in the time of the Holy Alliance of unhappy memory not only exerted a crippling influence on the whole of political and social life, but also put bonds upon the thoughts of men and raised against the further expansion of the evolutionary doctrine a dam which had to be broken down before any further advances in this direction could be thought of. Art, science, and philosophy fell under the dominion of the reactionary course of ideas, and a new spirit had to be born in Europe before a new impetus could be given to the theory of evolution. There were few glimpses of light in that long period of intellectual stagnation, and even they were scarcely noticed. Thus the English scholar W.C. Wells, as early as 1813, developed with some clearness the idea of natural selection. He recognized that a dark skin made men more capable of withstanding the dangers of a tropical climate, from which he deduced that originally only those individuals were able to survive in tropical regions whom nature for some reason or other had blessed with dark skin. Of course, Wells confined himself in his researches to definite types and made no attempt to test the general validity of the idea. The most important thing appearing in that dark period was Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which came out in 1830. This work, in which the English geologist attacked Cuvier's theory of cataclysms, was to prove of fundamental significance for the further shaping of the theory of evolution. Cuvier's authority in the field of natural history had till then been undisputed. Now Lyell maintained that all the changes in the surface of the earth were brought about not by sudden catastrophes, but by the unceasing operation of the same forces which are even today continuously at work. This theory, which Goethe had already postulated, was the necessary assumption for the whole evolutionary historical line of thought. Only by means of it was the idea of a gradual modification of species adapting themselves to the gradual alterations of the Earth's crust, made properly intelligible and scientifically thinkable. In the same year in which Lyell's work was given publicity, there took place in the Paris Academy that notable controversy between Cuvier and Saint Hilaire, which Goethe followed with such lively interest despite his extreme old age. Cuvier defended the doctrine of the permanency of species, while Saint Hilaire undertook to prove their alterability through the adaptation to the conditions of the environment. But the spirit of the time was against him, and Cuvier emerged victorious before the scientific world from a learned debate in which there was no lack of platitudes. All in that field of science were on his side and had only scorn and derision for his opponent. It looked as if the theory of evolution was done for once and for all, for Cuvier's doctrine was hardly attacked at all during the next 3 decades. Even after the appearance of Darwin's epoch-making work, the specialists in France, Germany, and other countries hesitated to take under consideration the ideas developed there, and a considerable time passed before they were able to resolve upon an earnest examination of the new theory. Neither did the idea of a natural selection among organic beings, to which the English investigator Patrick Matthew gave expression in the appendix to his book on shipbuilding and indigenous culture, meet with acceptance. The theory of evolution seemed, in fact, to be dead. Only with the decline of political and social reaction in Europe and the collapse of Hegel's doctrines did the demand for scientific thought in Europe come again into its own. Then the theory of evolution awoke to new life, and even before the appearance of Darwin's work, found courageous advocates in men like Spencer, Huxley, Voigt, Bichner, and others. The decisive victory of the doctrine of evolution was the appearance in 1859 of Darwin's great work, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, in which connection it is worth noting that Darwin was not a specialist in the usual sense, but, one might say, devoted himself to natural science as a hobby. We are confronted here with the same phenomenon which we can observe so frequently in connection with great discoveries and revolutionary intellectual achievements, and which merely affords further proof that in every field authority leads to ossification and sterility, while the free unfolding of ideas is always creative. Contemporaneously with Darwin, the English zoologist Alfred Russel Wallace, who was then pursuing his researches in Borneo, arrived at the same results, independently establishing the theory of natural selection in the same way as did Darwin. But the latter had, in the course of his extended research, gathered such a wealth of material and reviewed and elaborated it with such genius that Wallace modestly stepped back and conceded priority to his friend. Darwin set to work very cautiously with the results of his rich experience, mostly achieved during that notable trip around the world on board the Beagle, 1831-36, guarding himself against any generalizations that could not be established beyond call. So almost a quarter century went by before he laid his work before the public. Meanwhile, he had spared no pains, but had conferred diligently with breeders and husbandmen to learn what experience had taught them. The experiments which had been carried out on domestic animals and cultivated plants in the course of artificial breeding served to confirm his conclusion that similar processes took place in nature and led to the origin of new species. So he was able, with complete assurance, to let the world know of the results of his prolonged studies and to support his conclusions with an inexhaustible array of facts. Darwin came to the conclusion that alteration of species in nature is not the exception but the rule. His observations had convinced him that related species were descended from a common ancestral form, and that the differences among them had been brought about in the course of time by changed conditions of life, migrations, changes in feeding habits, and changes of climate. He supported this view chiefly by embryological researches, by which he showed that the differences between embryos of the various genera of animals are much smaller than those between the developed individuals. So there was a quite special importance in the discovery that organs which serve the same purpose have in the embryo very similar forms, even though they may have later, in the separate species, quite different appearances. A fact for which the only explanation can be that the different species have sprung from a common origin. The changes which appeared later were gradually transmitted to the descendants, and in such manner that the entire sequence of acquired characters is repeated in the embryo. Darwin recognized that adaptation of the different living beings to their environment is the most important law of life, and that species and individuals maintain themselves in the so-called struggle for existence, the more easily in proportion as they possess the ability of adapting themselves to environmental conditions. Thus, the theory of descent and the doctrine of natural selection were the cornerstones of the modern idea of evolution, and opened to it the broadest outlook upon every field of human research. Without them, the splendid results of modern anthropology, physiology, psychology, sociology, and so on would have been quite impossible. The impression produced by Darwin's work was overpowering. The idea of evolution had become so utterly strange to men during the period of political and intellectual reaction that most scholars regarded it as little more than a fairy tale. One can understand the powerful influence of the Darwinian theory upon his times only if one looks at what famous investigators who were his contemporaries had to say about it. Thus Weismann, in his Volgre über Daseinstheorie, declares, quote, "One cannot understand the effect of Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species if one does not know how completely the biologists of that time had abandoned general problems. I can only tell you that we younger men of the period, who were studying in the 50s, had no suspicion that a theory of evolution had ever been set forth, for no one spoke about it, and it was not even mentioned in lectures. It was as if all the teachers in our universities had drunk of Leth and had completely forgotten that any such thing had ever been discussed, or even as if they were ashamed of these philosophical excursions of natural science and wanted to protect you from that sort of thing." End quote. In his first work, Darwin had left the question of the descent of man untouched on purpose. Still, it lay in the nature of his theory that man could not occupy an exceptional place in nature. It was therefore only logical that well-known investigators like Thomas Huxley and Ernst Haeckel should draw from the newly acquired understanding the inevitable conclusion and set man in his place as a member of the long line of organic living beings. By this, the opponents of Darwinism were, of course, still more aroused against the new doctrine, especially after Huxley had published his book, Evidences of Man's Place in Nature. But no obstacles could bar the way of the victoriously advancing ideas. Not until 1871 did Darwin, in his great work, The Descent of Man and Natural Selection with Regard to Sex, take a stand upon this much disputed problem and answer it in accord with his first work. But the theory of the great English thinker was by no means finished with this book, just as little as was the theory of Copernicus in his time. It rather gave the impulse to new investigations and reflections by which some of Darwin's ideas were corrected and others carried further. Darwin indeed understood clearly that his theory needed much more work, knew only too well that ideas also must go through a definite process of development. Thus, for example, the idea of natural selection as it had been developed by Darwin and Wallace in the course of time underwent much change to set its importance in correct relation to that of other factors which cooperate with it in the modification of species. On the basis of the Darwinian theory of descent, Spencer was able to prove that the countless genera of animals and plants on the earth had developed from a few simple organisms. Haeckel was able to go so far as to construct a family tree for the entire animal kingdom, inclusive of man, in his Nationalism. The German scholar attaches a special importance to the biogenetic law, according to which the individual development of a living being is in high degree a brief and rapidly completed recapitulation of all the changes of form through which the entire ancestry of the genus has passed in the course of its natural evolution, and which are dependent on the physiological processes of inheritance, reproduction, and nutrition. This new insight into the process of evolution led in turn to a whole series of new interpretations in the most widely separated fields of scientific investigation, by which the limits of our knowledge were very notably extended. Darwin and Wallace believed that they had found an adequate explanation of the alterations in living forms in the mechanical selection of the best, and were convinced that this selection occurred as the result of a constant struggle between the different species, and also within the same species, in the course of which the weak species and individuals succumbed and only the strong were able to survive. We know that Darwin was strongly influenced in the development of this theory by the reading of Malthus's book on the population problem. He later greatly revised this opinion and, especially in his work on the origin of man, reached essentially different results. But the theory of the struggle for existence, as it was first presented in incomplete and one-sided form, exercised a powerful influence on a whole line of distinguished investigators, especially on the founders of the so-called social Darwinism. Men came to regard nature as a monstrous battlefield on which the weak were pitilessly trodden down by the strong, and, in fact, believed that within every genus there went on a sort of perpetual civil war arising from natural necessities. A large number of scholars, among them Huxley and Spencer, at first saw human society also in this light, and were of the firm conviction that they were on the track of a natural law of universal validity. Thus Hobbes' war of all against all became once more the unalterable course of nature, which could be changed by no ethical considerations, and the advocates of social Darwinism never tired of mouthing the gloomy declaration of Malthus that the table of life is not spread for everyone. This notion no doubt arose from the bourgeois attitude of the scholars without their being themselves aware of it. Capitalistic society had made the principle of free competition the cardinal point of economics. What therefore was simpler than to see in this merely an extension of that same struggle, which, according to the view of many distinguished Darwinians, was to be seen everywhere in nature, and which not even man could escape. In this way, justification was found for every human exploitation and oppression, by tracing it to the operation of an inexorable natural law. Huxley, in his well-known work, The Struggle for Existence and Its Bearing on Man, had, with the consistency that was characteristic of him, unreservedly advocated this point of view, and thus, contrary to his intention, forged a weapon for social reaction which even today is occasionally made to serve it as a means of defense. The thinkers of the period took these things the more seriously because the most of them were so firmly convinced of the inexorable struggle in nature that they assumed it unconditionally without taking the trouble to examine the assumption carefully. There were at that time only a few supporters of the Darwinian theory who questioned the correctness of this view. To this view belonged most notably the Russian zoologist Kessler, who as early as 1880 at a natural science congress in St. Petersburg announced his opinion that, along with the brutal struggle with tooth and claw in nature, there prevails still another law which finds expression in mutual assistance within the society of living species and contributes essentially to the maintenance of the race. This idea, which Kessler merely referred to hurriedly, was given a far-reaching application by Peter Kropotkin in his well-known work Mutual Aid, a Factor of Evolution. Kropotkin showed on the basis of a wealth of factual material that the presentation of nature as an unlimited battlefield was only a caricature of life which does violence to the real facts. Like Kessler, he also emphasized the importance for the preservation of the species of its members living together in societies and the instincts of mutual aid and solidarity which grow out of it. This second form of the struggle for existence seemed to him of incomparably greater importance, as well for the preservation of the individual as for the maintenance of the race, than the brutal warfare of the strong against the weak, a view which is confirmed by the noticeable degeneracy of those species which have no social life and try to maintain themselves by mere physical superiority. While Kessler was of the opinion that the instinct of sympathy is a result of parental affection and the care of offspring, Kropotkin took the standpoint that we are dealing here simply with a result of social living together, which man inherited from his animal ancestors, who, like him, lived in societies. Thus regarded, man was not the creator of society, but society the creator of man. This view, which has since been accepted by numerous investigators, is especially for sociology of wide applicability, for it throws a new light on the whole evolutionary history of man and stimulates most fruitful reflections. It would lead us too far to enter in detail into all the numerous evolutionary factors of the Darwinian theory. The theory of selection, and more especially the problem of heredity, have given rise to a whole series of scientific investigations which have advanced the evolutionary doctrine in general, even if their outcome has not always been very successful. Many theories which were thus set up appear, perhaps, all too daring and too lacking in foundations. Still, one must not forget that it is not the positive results alone that serve to advance an idea. Hypotheses also can inspire to new considerations and greatly accelerate research. This is especially true of the Weizmannian theory of inheritance and of all the attempts at explanation in this field that have been made by meritorious investigators like Mendel, Nageli, de Vries, Roux, and their numerous followers, as also by the advocates of neo-Lamarckianism and by the defendants and opponents of the mutation theory. The most of these attempts at explanation have beyond doubt contributed to the further development of the theory of evolution, though they are in detail far too complicated for one to estimate with certainty their actual importance for the future. It would be labor loss to attempt a survey of an intellectual phenomenon of such enormous range as the modern theory of evolution according to its national constituents. A whole army of thinkers and investigators of all peoples and nations, of whom only a few of the better-known names can here be mentioned, has contributed to the universal upbuilding of this theory and given it intellectual impetus. No nation could escape its influence. It has directed the entire thought of the men of our cultural circle into definite lines, revalued all previous assumptions concerning man and distinguishing members of different human groups, which at the best are all that can be established, and which are, in the end, only results of trained in understandings, ideas, and habits, in comparison with the overpowering effect of an idea or concept of the universe which applies to all men with equal force and strides on across all artificially constructed national boundaries. No, the human mind will not permit itself to be bound in the chains of artificially created prejudice, and will not endure the restraint of national limitation. The individual may be held temporarily or permanently under the spell of a national ideology, just as perhaps the man of science may be influenced by the inbred prejudices of his class or station. But no power is in a position to give a national stamp to science as such, or to fix the thought of a people by the artificial norms of a so-called national idea. Whither such attempts led, the present conditions in Germany and Italy show us with complete clarity. The mere fact that the national-minded in every country persuade themselves that they must enforce their peculiar lines of ideas upon all others, if necessary even against their will, is the announcement of intellectual bankruptcy of nationalism of every sort. If national sentiment were in fact a clearly recognizable spiritual phenomenon, which shaped itself in men into a kind of instinct, then this feeling would be alive in every one of us, and would assert itself with compelling necessity, and there would be no need to cultivate it and force it upon the consciousness of men artificially. We have purposely brought up for consideration the Copernican system of the universe and the theory of evolution, because in them the universal character of human thought shows most clearly. To achieve the same result, it would suffice to have brought out any special branch of science, a philosophical theory, a social popular movement, or a great discovery. Every bit of scientific knowledge, every philosophical consideration of man and the universe, every social movement which is born of the conditions of the time, every practical application of acquired knowledge in technique and industry, is fostered and built up by members of all nations. One can just as little speak of a national science as of a national system of the universe or a national theory of earthquakes. Science as such has nothing in common with national ambitions. It stands rather in unmistakable opposition to them, for while it is without doubt one of the most effective factors that unite men and bind them to one another, nationalism is an element that estranges them from one another and always tries to make their natural intercourse difficult and hostile. It is not the nation which shapes the thought of our species and inspires and equips it for new experiments. It is the culture circle to which we belong that brings to maturity everything intellectual in us and constantly stimulates it. No national isolation can withdraw us from this influence. It can only contribute to our cultural impoverishment and the curtailment of our intellectual endowments and capacities, as is shown today with terrifying consistency, especially in Germany.
This has been a production of Audible Anarchist. You can find more Audible Anarchist on YouTube.